Joseph, thanks so much for coming in, man.
My pleasure. Good to see you, Shad.
The Pan Am Games, the Parapan Ams are sporting events, but they also put the spotlight on their host nation. When you meet people outside of the U.S. and beyond through your writing, what Canadian issues do they ask you about? It's
funny. You don't get a lot. It's the same thing it's been, since I've been an adult. I go down to the States and they really don't, Americans don't really get Canada.
Yeah.
They don't really think about us too much is what I think it boils down to.
So in terms of the Pan Ams, have you been seeing the kind of spotlight or conversation on issues that you wanted to see?
Not enough, I've in the last couple of years, I don't know if it's political I've gotten, but it's certainly a sense of social justice has creeped into my being, and that desire to see some change that I think really needs to happen in this country. I think this is a wonderful chance to begin to address some of the issues that I think are really important to this country.
It's so interesting. I mentioned the Sochi Olympics in the intro, and the sort of international spotlight that put on LGBT rights and issues in Russia, the World Cup in South Africa. It's funny sometimes how hard it can be to reflect on ourselves and see our own issues in that way. But sporting events like this, they do provide an opportunity. And I do know that there is a gaze coming from certain places that understand our country has issues.
Yeah, and I think as a country, the only way we're going to grow stronger is to admit that sometimes we're not perfect. It's like being in a relationship. It's not all bliss all the time. You've got to accept that there are issues that we need to deal with, and obviously for me, it's if anyone who knows me, it's First Nations issues is what I think is really important in this country. The fastest growing population in our country is First Nations youth. The most poverty-stricken portion of our country is First Nations youth, and so coming to terms with why this is, and going beyond that's your issue, it's your problem, blame the victim. That time is over. I think that ended with Idle No More, and a few years ago, and the realization and recognition that as Canadians, our history hasn't been perfect, but and history continues to resonate today.
Yeah. Recognizing this in an international sort of lens really struck me one time when I was on tour in Europe. I did an interview in Germany, and the last question I got was about First Nations issues. And the look in the interviewer's eyes was this look of, that's the shame of your country, right? Like, that's how we view you. And it was so interesting that it took me being outside of my country to sort of look at it that way, yeah.
That's what I've noticed too in Europe. Europeans are much more in tune with Canada and what Canada is than Americans are with what Canada is.
The final report for the Truth and Reconciliation Commission into Canada's residential schools was released just prior to the Games, presented an opportunity for a national conversation about reconciliation. What's your sense of the aftermath to the TRC?
I was there. I was made an honorary witness, and so that's something I carry very proudly, but with great care as well. And this is, the truth is there and has been there. It's out in this book, and it's out in the world. What the damage of residential schools, and the reconciliation part is going to be the hard part. This is the ongoing discussion, and it's going to often be a very uncomfortable discussion. And having witnessed a number of the commission's gatherings, I've realized myself the pain that so many of these people continue to suffer, and it's intergenerational trauma. I wrote a piece in Maclean's about it shortly after the TRC, and it wasn't my typical style of writing. It was very much, it was hard. It was as honest and straight as I could be. I see that in this country there are certain parties who refuse to accept or to want to even include First Nations, and I think this is going to be hugely problematic moving forward. The good thing is, though, I think Canadians, I really see a sea change happening. I see a change happening in our country where Canadians want to know more about our history, and when I talk about our history, I mean the good and the bad. Residential schools are a horrific attempt at cultural genocide, and the highest court in the land, has said that, and Canadians are recognizing, our history isn't perfect. Our history didn't begin in 1867 when Johnny MacDonald said, let's start this country. It goes far, far farther back than that. And I've always argued that Canada's not a country of two solitudes, but of three. The English, the French, and also the First Nations. And that's how these solitudes manage to cross boundaries and build bridges. And I'm not seeing in our current federal government a lot of bridge building going on, unfortunately. And I think that's something that really needs to change.
You said that this was a hard piece for you to write. It's not your typical kind of writing.
Yeah.
But you felt it necessary to sort of wade into different territory?
I did. I'm from a very large family, and I've always been the diplomat, the peacemaker. My Anishinaabe name is Wase Ashkong, which is literally translates to shining bridge or he who enlightens. And I would have much rather something cool like Screaming Eagle or something, but you get what you're given. And I'm very, I tease, but I think that we need to build bridges. And with this article that I wrote, I saw something happening, and I saw a real skewing of recent statistics on the missing and murdered Indigenous women in this country. Suddenly people were saying, 90% of the murders of these women are happening by their husbands. It's like, wait a second, back up. This is not true. Let's look at the real statistics. The statistics were being used politically to skew the situation and to throw it back in the faces of First Nations people. I think that's incredibly hurtful and harmful. The truth of that, if you go and look at those statistics, the truth is that if you're an Aboriginal woman, you're more likely to be killed by a person you don't know well than a non-Aboriginal woman is. And so, the statistics are actually very wrong-headed. The use of them was very wrong-headed by certain parties. And it's that kind of thing, always having to fight against that current, that tide, that seems very unfair to me.
And you see that current, that tide coming from the government. What about public conversation?
The public conversation's a lot different. There's always, after that McLean's article, my couple of friends wrote and said, don't read the comments.
Of course.
And of course I did.
No!
Only a couple.
Okay.
But, there's that kind of conversation, which is the hidden one. But the open conversation in this country, people want to hear and want to know, what can I do? How can we change? What is reconciliation? And I think it begins with, very simply, education. I think that in our grade schools, starting in our grade schools, students should be taught the real history or the complete history. If you remember back to your education, I bet you don't remember a lot about First Nations being taught. Yeah. But if students are taught that, our country is a great country, obviously, but we've made our mistakes, and this is one big one. I think that there's nothing wrong in that. That's only can be positive, I think, that admission of the complete story. No, it's not just history belongs to the victor. That's a great saying and a great cliche. History needs to belong to all of us.
I mentioned at the outset, you live in New Orleans, Louisiana. You also live in Canada. Mm-hmm. Huge conversations going on in the States around race, for the last year or two especially. Do you see parallels between the conversations around race going on in the United States and what's happening here in Canada?
In the States, and very rightfully so, the deaths of so many young African Americans, men and women now, with the Sandra Bland, just tragic. And people are up at arms, and they are upset, and they're going to the streets. And a lot of the vigils that I've seen are peaceful, but the people are getting angry and upset that this is, America is, after the different Gulf Wars, the police were just flooded with all of these crazy new weapons, and what's going on with this kind of militarization of the police. And so there's that conversation going on in the States. In Canada, we seem, a little more polite when we discuss race. We're kind of scared to. We're scared to jump into that fray. We're not quite sure what to say. We hem and we haw, and that's the biggest difference I see. And I think we have to. I don't want to say get angry, but we certainly have to get a little more brave in our discussions and be able to say, listen, this is not just a First Nations problem, or this is not just another race's issue. This is an issue for all of us to face. And the issue I'm speaking about specifically right now is the treatment of our First Nations in this country, and especially our women. If to be born an Aboriginal woman, you're 4 times more likely to be killed violently than any other group. And that is much more obviously than a criminal issue. That's a deeply sociological one, and everyone, I think, who thinks about it knows that. And so I think we have to begin treating it as such. And I think I'm not going to stop arguing that we need a national inquiry desperately in this country to look at this issue.
And I think you're sort of insinuating that we have something to learn from the rage that we see in the conversation around race in the United States. Is the sort of level of emotionality that's brought to that conversation and frankness?
Absolutely, yeah. There is a frankness in the States. Americans are, and I don't want to pigeonhole all Americans, but Americans are much less shy to be frank in their opinions than Canadians are. We're a careful people, and I appreciate that and I like that. But I think we have to, at this point in time, get upset that our women, and I'm not just saying First Nations, but our women are being treated in such horrendous ways by some obviously very sick people. And we should be horrified as a nation that we're letting this happen. We should be horrified as a nation that our Aboriginal youth in northern communities are 100 times more likely to commit suicide than any other great age group, any other population. Our northern reserves are often considered the suicide capitals of the world, and yet we don't want to face that and say, why aren't we facing that? It's not just their issue. This is an issue for all of us. It's our children, not just their children.
What do you think it is about Canadian culture that makes it harder for us to have those conversations? I mean, those statistics you just throw out, they're terribly painful and troubling. What do you think it is about us?
It's a little bit out of sight, out of mind. And in some ways, I think that it's a matter of, you'll hear the news. For example, in Moosonee, 100 kids attempted suicide in a population of 2,500 over the course of a year. And then that goes away quickly. Because we don't want to, who wants to sit down and have to face that every day? That's a depressing statistic. And it's what can I do about it? I can't do anything about it, I think people feel. When in actuality, that's not the case at all. I spend so much time in New Orleans, but I've helped build a camp up in northern Ontario, south of Moosonee, 50 miles or so off the Polar Bear Express, to get youth on the land and to get youth reattached and to find a way again. And so we can do something. And it's important that we do. And the first way to do it is to educate ourselves. Find people are like, I wish I knew more about First Nations. You'll never meet better people. Go to a reserve, go say hi, go to a Tribe Called Red show, check it out. And you're going to see something that you'll probably change your mind very, very quickly about First Nations people, and the situation.
How did you find your role in this conversation?
It's interesting, like I said, I'm always the one. I'm a writer for a reason. I like to sit back in the background and quietly create. But I've realized over the years, and I've been told by important people over the years that, listen, you have a platform, and I think that if you don't utilize that in a positive way, you're throwing it away. Basil Johnson is an incredible Anishinaabe elder who gave me that name, Wase Ashkong, and I heard him loud and clear when he said, you need to be one who enlightens. You have a chance to do that, and I think you need to continue doing that. That is your role. And I was like, oh, do I have to, Basil? He's like, yeah, I think you do. And so you listen to your elders, and if I do have a chance to speak about issues that I see, and it's not always negative too, there's so much beauty and positive going on in our First Nations communities. There's so, look at Tanya Tagak, look at, like I mentioned, Tribe Called Red, Wabkashig Rice, Wab Canoe, amazing role models, and amazing, positive, powerful, vibrant people. I don't always want to paint the doom and gloom of the First Nations, but certainly we have to face that there are issues that we all as Canadians need to address, not just our First Nations people.
I read something really interesting, really beautiful and poignant to me about the artist's sense of the moment. Do you feel like this is a moment?
I do. I really do. I feel over these last few years, as I mentioned, I feel a tide changing in this country. I feel that we are, as a nation, despite what I think some don't want to happen, we as a nation are beginning to want to address some of the ills and also recognize some of the beauty too. And I really feel that change happening in this country in increments. It's not going to change overnight. But the Truth and Reconciliation Commission was a huge step forward, and a very painful one in so many ways. But it was a huge step for Canadians to begin to recognize, oh, wait a second, residential schools. A few years ago, I'll guarantee you, most people didn't know, or if they did know, they knew very little about them. Weren't they just boarding schools, Yeah. And giving kids an education? No, they were not. These were institutions that were often horrific. But Canadians more and more are understanding too, oh, this isn't, I'm not being blamed for this. It's, this is not a blame game at this point in time. This is a time for us all to begin to understand what some of us had to go through. And that might very well be why many of us are in situations that aren't great right now. Residential schools, the whole point of them was to separate the child from the parent. And when that happens generation after generation, you lose your parenting skills. You lose so much of the social skills. And so, residential schools, I've made the connection and argued the connection between residential schools and these high suicide rates we see today among youth. I've made the connection in that McLean's article recently about residential schools and tying it to our murdered and missing Indigenous women and how these are connected. These are not separate entities. There's negative coming that was going to continue to resonate out of these schools for a while to come.
Education, as you mentioned, is a big piece of that. Art can also help that history come alive. Do you ever worry, though, that that Canadians might only be engaging with Aboriginal issues through culture?
That's interesting. It's a great way to begin to engage, for sure. I think that there's no harm in that happening, but I think and not everyone's going to say, okay, well, I'm going to become an advocate for First Nations. I understand that, but certainly, what I get to do, I'm lucky. I get to sit down and write these novels, and my first job as a novelist is to entertain, is to tell a good story. I want first and foremost a reader to pick up my book and say, oh, I'll turn the page. Oh, I'll turn another page. I like this story. That's my first job. But it's always character and story first. And I never kind of wield that hammer of righteousness in my fiction at all, I don't think. But certainly, organically, a lot of the issues that I do see in this country begin to creep in and seep into the fiction, and through Black Spruce, Will Bird, the protagonist, is a mess. And I get to explore why he's a mess at this point. And it points to a number of the issues that I talk about in real life. And so culturally, I think it's the perfect first step for Canadians to engage. I think that, as artists, we're really lucky to be able to have this kind of platform that I talk about, to not just entertain, but possibly to educate as well. And so I think that's a great jumping off point, but I think there's a lot of Canadians want more than that even.
Well, I'm looking forward to seeing how you continue to use your platform. Joseph, thanks so much.
My pleasure, Shad. Great to see you.